myself, if nothing because my job title's almost impossible. And I think in this postmodern world, it's always nice to know who people are and where they've come from in order to see what they say. I'm Australian. I am by origin a Paleolithic archaeologist. I am by publication an industrial archaeologist, so I have a passion for all those industrial landscapes that we heard about in the second talk this morning and we saw in the last talk this morning. I have, over the last 5 or 6 years, been gradually transforming myself from an archaeologist into a heritage bureaucrat. And I now work for English Heritage, where I've been both an inspector of ancient monuments, I've worked on buildings, and now I'm working in the policy section. So I've been around the houses, if you like. But what I have become most interested in, and what I really would like to talk about to you today, because I think it is fundamental to the sorts of things we've been discussing, is the idea of conservation. Now, conservation has, I think in some senses, become a dirty word. It's something that stops progress. It prevents people from designing creatively. It's associated with this idea of fossilization, of stopping change, of preventing people from fulfilling their potential. A lot of architects I work with, not necessarily English Heritage, feel that conservation is not something that they can possibly reconcile with genuine creativity. Now, I think that there's a lot more to conservation than that, and I think that there is a very exciting new conservation ethos that is beginning to emerge, not only in this country, but abroad, and I think that we can learn a lot from what's happening in the third world. And I think that conservation ethos is something that ought to be taking conservation from what might have once been a very narrow elitist interest to something that really is part of mainstream society, economy, and life today. And this is really what I want to talk about, a sort of new and holistic vision for conservation that takes it away from the elite towards something that's very much more important to all of us. But if we're going to do that, I think those of us who are heritage bureaucrats, if you like, have to rethink the way we work, what we do, and how we see what we conserve. And that's really where I want to begin. We've got pictures, if I press forward. Yeah. Okay. Conservation used to be easy. Things used to be conserved because, like Avebury on the left, they were old, or because, like Blenheim on the right, they had architects or aesthetic or were beautiful. We designated scheduled ancient monuments. We identified listed buildings. We drew lines around them and we said, there be heritage. We also used to have a very nice, comfortable dichotomy between town and countryside, something which I think we saw this morning is not at all a real dichotomy at all. But we used to have, we still do have, the idea of conservation areas in urban areas, and we had countryside in rural areas. There were nice, simple dividing lines between the two. To that, as the pioneers on the course at the AA have shown, we've added the idea of gardens and a variety of other sorts of sites that we might want to conserve. There is also, of course, other types of conservation, most notably ecological conservation, natural conservation. And the defining character of all of these approaches to conservation is each of them involves a specialist interest and a specialist type of site around which we draw nice lines. And those lines are physical. We draw lines around scheduled ancient monuments, we draw lines around conservation areas, we draw lines around registered parks and gardens, we draw lines around SSSIs and sites that we think are important. And at the same time, we draw professional lines. I am an archaeologist, you are an architectural historian, he is an ecologist. All of us have a different resource, a different type of significance, a different approach to conservation, a different type of legislation, a different type of management system, and a different outlook. We don't come together, we don't talk to each other, we don't work together, we don't share ideas, we don't share our language. the result of this sort of thing is the persistence of an image which is, I'm afraid, still around. I've been working on the government's review of the heritage, and this was put to me very, very forcefully by the very well-informed group that were working with me on part of the review. We are still seen as essentially antiquarian, hence the picture on the left, and we are still seen, and I think this is true, as essentially white. We serve a very, very narrow portion of society, and we serve a relatively narrow set of interests. All is not lost, because I think what is beginning to emerge in conservation as it is practiced on the ground is a new approach. There are two key elements to this. First of all, I think that we, in the historic world, if you like, are beginning to learn from sustainable development. Learn the lessons that perhaps the natural environment learnt 10 or 15 years ago, that what we're doing is looking at a very different model of conservation that's about passing things on to future generations, that's about moving away from isolated, if you like, animals in zoos towards habitats and places, and towards recognizing that conservation is not a kind of narrow scientific interest. It's something that has to be embraced with all aspects of life. If we're going to do conservation successfully, we need to work with the economy, we need to work with society, we need to work with business, we need to work with people. And that's the purpose of the second slide, which is to recognise that we need to work with people, and that means the whole of society and not just a narrow range of interests. So for me, if you like, and I think for many of us, the definition that we now work with in conservation is, and I know that we can debate this with David Jacques for some time, but for me it's about passing on to future generations what we value. So we're getting away from this idea of restoration, of stopping change, towards a very much more dynamic definition that is about not stopping change, but managing change, and managing change intelligently. So, fine, that's great. But how do we manage change? What does managing change involve? What are the basic principles? You know, how do we cope with a resource that is changing anyway? You know, do we just throw it open to the winds? Do we just say that anything goes? Or do we try and manage change intelligently? And I think, for me, there are some very good ways in which we are able to manage change today. The first thing we need to do is to rethink what it is we are conserving. We began with this idea of isolated sites, individual places, little bits of the landscape that were intelligent. This is a picture of Clun Castle in Shropshire. I lived in Shropshire for a decade or so. And on the left you've got this idea of the ancient monument. Look, it's nicely mown. There it is, conserved, restored, left. But if you look at the picture on the right, you can see Clun Castle in its landscape. Somewhere in there. You've got the castle itself, you've got the motte, and you've got the bailey. And you can see to the right the beginnings of patterns that are beginning to emerge from the aerial photograph of what I think were the medieval gardens that were associated with the castle. And you can see also beside it the village of Clun and the relationship between the castle and the village and the way those two have developed. And that relationship continues right up to the present day, when part of the castle is used for the bowling green by the village. In other words, where is the boundary of the monument? And where is the boundary of the interest of the monument? You can't draw a tight line around that and say, here be heritage, and there don't. What you've got is a monument in its landscape, in its setting, which extends not just to the castle, its motte and its bailey, but to the village and the patterns and the fields and the landscapes around it, but also extends through time up to the present day, when it has a meaning and use for people in the village. So we're beginning to move away from the idea of isolated monuments towards a much more holistic vision of what it is that we're seeking to conserve. And you can see this particularly in the countryside, coming out of the work that Graham Fairclough and others have been doing on our countryside characterisation programme. Some of you may know about this. It's a programme of work looking at the character of the countryside and how it's been changing through time. And you can see, for example, these pictures illustrate that what one's looking at in the landscape are not isolated sites, but essentially patterns. Patterns which change through time. On the left, you've got the Bronze Age field systems still surviving in the pattern of stone walls. On the right, you've got medieval strip fields extending back from houses in a village. See how the settlement and the landscape cannot ever be separated. But see how also both of these areas have got very, very distinctive patterns. They're not monuments, but patterns, and that pattern extends across the whole of the landscape. And you can see again in these slides similar examples of changing and evolving patterns. On the left, you've got former strip fields enclosed now by hedges, and on the right, you've got more recent enclosure. Again, all of these are of different dates, but they've survived today in what you can see around us. And these historical patterns shape what is essentially the character of these places. I think character is a very, very good word. It doesn't say special or outstanding or beautiful or anything like that. It just says it's character. And that's what we've been seeking to do with much of our landscape characterization work. I think it's going to prove a very, very powerful tool for planning decisions. The important thing about this work also is that there are no boundaries to it. It assumes that everywhere has a character. Now that character may be valuable or not, it may be degraded or not, but everywhere has a character. There are no sensible lines to be drawn when we're trying to establish what the character and significance of the landscape is. And of course, the landscape not only includes the countryside as we see it, but coastlines and all that brings, extending out below the sea. And of course, I haven't got any slides, but the divisions between, as I said earlier, urban and rural are not fixed. We have urban countryside, we have rural urban areas, we have rural features in towns. Again, you know, there are no hard and fast lines here. What we're beginning to see here is that if around us we have a whole, if you like, historic environment that can't be sort of divided up into separate monuments, it raises a very interesting question, because it says to us, well, if there's not a dividing line in the historic environment, where's the dividing line between the natural environment and the historic environment? Is there such a thing as a natural environment which can be separated from the historic environment? Can we draw a line and say, you know, here is ecology and there is heritage? Try as I might, just about the only example I can come up with of genuine wilderness is probably Antarctica, and even that's got the explorers' huts in it. If you think about it, practically every landscape on the globe is the product of human management and human intervention. And on the left, the picture is Langdale Axe Factory. It looks like you're looking at a wonderful piece of wilderness. In fact, you're looking at a very significant Neolithic axe factory. All of the landscape is shaped by human intervention. And if that is the case, are the divisions that we've traditionally drawn between ecology and archaeology, between heritage and the natural environment, valid ones? Do they work? Can we actually manage the natural environment if we don't understand the historical dimension to it? What is a hedge? Is it natural? Is it human? So what certainly we, and the people that many of the people that I've sort of worked with and learned from, particularly Graham Fairclough, who should have been doing the talk today, are moving towards, is this concept of historic environment. It has no boundaries, it has no definitions, it has no limits. It is around us. It is in this room, it is in the square outside, it is in the most degraded social housing in inner cities. It's everywhere. And if you take the idea with the limits of the natural environment, it's the same with the natural environment. I mean, where does the natural environment to some extent end? I mean, are cockroaches part of ecology? The answer is yes. The problem is that some aspects of the natural environment are valuable and we seek to manage them, and some aspects are less valuable. And here is a very important analogy for the historic environment. If we say that the historic environment is the whole of the physical remains which surround us today, which we've inherited from the past, this leaves us with a bit of a problem for conservation. What are we handing on? What are we doing? Why are we bothering? You know, what matters and what doesn't? If we leave the nice safe ground of scheduled ancient monuments with lines drawn them around them, how do we conserve? It's very simple. What we conserve is actually what we value. Somebody this morning talked about meaning, and that was a very, very, very important phrase, because what we are interested in conserving, indeed what we've always conserved, is what is valuable or significant. Now, for the ecologists, it's nice and simple. They've got sort of little scientific diagrams that tell you how many species there are, how rare they are, you know, what's happening to them. They have endangered lists of ants and termites and all that sort of thing. But for the historic environment, what do we mean by what is significant, what is valuable? It used to be very simple. We used to see that it used to be very much about aesthetics, things that had an architect, things that were designed, things that were beautiful, things that were old. I think in modern society we're having to recognise that the values that we're seeking to conserve and hand on to future generations are very, very much more complex than that, and very, very much more interesting. And in that, I think, is the key to conservation becoming more relevant. I'm an archaeologist, and for me, one of the primary values in the historic environment is that the fabric of the past, the remains around us, whether they're buildings, whether they're landscapes, whether they're buried or above ground sites, are a document. And they document people. They document aspects of our history that we will never find out from any other source. I'm an industrial archaeologist. I'm used to people saying, hey, you can look it up in the documents. I know that there is a whole history of Britain written in buildings and spaces and boundaries and landscapes that we will never find out from the documentary research. So for me, one of the primary values of the fabric of the past is that it is a document which will teach us about ourselves. That's a personal view of an archaeologist. It's not a universal view. There are many, many other values of the past, and this is what we have to recognise. We can see in landscapes the history of agriculture, as in the ridge and furrow on the left-hand side. We know from the AA course here that we can see in landscapes a history of design, aesthetics, changing ideas of society, who people thought they were, who they aspired to be. So there's another whole history there written in the fabric. For me, as an industrial archaeologist, there's the story of the Industrial Revolution and industrialisation written in the fabric of landscapes. On the right is a little tiny squatter cottage. It's a very ordinary little building up in the Ironbridge Gorge. It was built by a family using local materials, no architect, no designer, on a piece of land that they were squatting on. There were obviously mobile labour force come to work in the mines. Now this building is a unique document of a social process that we can find out about in no other way. These people's lives were not documented. So there's a whole social process in the fabric of the landscape. But there are many other narratives and stories and values in the landscape and buildings and sites which make up the historic environment. And perhaps the one we have most ignored is the whole multicultural dimension to the landscape around us. The buildings of Bristol are founded on the wealth derived from slavery. Much of our finest architecture is founded on the wealth derived from exploitation. There is another story to what there is around us. It's an important story and it's a valuable story. If many people feel excluded from the idea of heritage, and I know because we've just been doing a Maori poll that shows that a very large percentage of people in this country, particularly non-white people, don't see the heritage as anything to do with them, it is because that narrative and that story has not been told. So we've got a job to do. to recognise there are other stories, other values and other narratives in the past. And I think we have to do this if we are to make conservation more relevant to people today. We began by talking about aesthetics, and we had a very interesting last paper discussing different views of aesthetics. We talk about landscape, we tend to assume an aesthetic. I'm an industrial archaeologist, that's Paris Mountain and Anglesey. I think there are some extraordinary aesthetics in landscape, in industrial landscapes, some exciting aesthetics. We don't necessarily need to assume that landscapes are invariably green, pretty and beautiful in order to be valuable. More than that, we need to recognise that there are different aesthetics and different views, and we need to take these into account in conservation. We cannot go on assuming that there is a sort of single value to the past. And of course, we value the landscapes around us for many other reasons. We value them for leisure. I mean, many people will never have visited a garden, but will use the landscape for sport, for walking. That's my family. When they were rather smaller than they are now, they're very big and scary. But we all use landscapes in many, many different ways. Conservation needs to acknowledge this if it's to succeed. And there are other types of values that we put on the past. Many people have spiritual values for places. Sometimes we don't sympathise with them. I mean, one of the problems we've been having in English heritage, you probably read about this, was the difficulties over the Sea Henge, the Timber Circle, where there were a group of people that had a very different set of values for that monument than perhaps we might have. 20 years ago, we could have dismissed those values. We could have said, forget it. We're English heritage. We're going to tell you what's important about the past. I think today, with a new emerging model of conservation, we have to recognise and work with other values for the past. Now, if that means working with the pagans or with the witches or with different faiths in this country, then perhaps that's something that we need to learn to do if conservation is going to become much more relevant. And of course, landscapes are places where we live and work. I probably should have done something more serious on barn conversions, but I haven't today. We need to recognise, as we've heard in the second paper this morning, that landscapes are economic places. They're places where people make a living. They're not things that we can possibly fossilise if conservation is going to succeed. Another aspect of value that I think is changing in the way we now look at conservation is this idea of national importance. Most of the designations that we've worked with in conservation have been based on the idea that things are universally important. They are nationally important. It's a kind of top-down value, our most important buildings, our most important sites. Anybody who's ever done any practical conservation work knows that to succeed you need to work with local values. You cannot ignore local values. One of our problems is we've had no designations that reflect local values. So if people have come to us and said, I've got a fabulous building, it's my local area, we'd like you to list it, we've had to say no, because our legislation is predicated on national values. So we do have a bit of a problem here. But I'm saying that the emerging new version of conservation has to recognise local values and work with them, and not necessarily work with a kind of nostalgic view of the past. So, what I've been trying to say, I began by talking about the idea of historic environment, the way in which conservation is moving away from individual monuments to a holistic environment. What I then did was try to focus on what we're trying to conserve, and that is, if you like, significance, meaning, and to recognise that meaning is a very complicated thing. There are lots of different meanings for the past. If we're going to conserve successfully, we need to work with all those different meanings. But that leaves us the question of what happens if we don't. One of the things that I've learnt from working with ecologists, and particularly looking at the literature on sustainability, is one thing that they do that we don't do very well at all, is think about how their resource is being lost. What's happening to their resource? We know about how many songbirds have been lost. We know about what's happening to field boundaries. We know about which species are threatened. Do we ever talk about, we're beginning to talk about buildings at risk, but how consistently do we understand what is happening to the historic environment around us. And I've got a particular passion for small industrial buildings. I happen to know that the Black Country Chainmakers Workshop is on the verge of extinction. And there's only one left, and I think that's in the Black Country Museum. There are whole classes of buildings, whole classes of landscapes, whole classes of sites that are almost extinct. And when we lose them, we lose some of the diversity of the historic environment. So one of the things I think that the new model of conservation needs to do is to begin to focus on and think about not just what's important, but what we're losing. I found this book the other day, absolutely wonderful book. I discovered it in a bookshop in Australia. It's called Returning to Nothing, The Meaning of Lost Places. It's by a man called Peter Reed, and it's about what happens when places lose their meanings. Now, he was talking primarily about disasters, Cyclone Tracy in Darwin, the landslide at Adaminiemi, a number of other disasters. He also talked about bad planning decisions and what happens when bad planning decisions erode places of their meanings. And I was quite interested to read in the newspaper the other day of the women of Chechnya, who, following the war and in a scene of extreme devastation, simply got out their buckets and their trowels and the mortar and began to rebuild the railway station. Why? Because having lost family, having lost everything else, somehow rebuilding place mattered. And I think this is a very important lesson for us. Places matter to people. And we do have a duty to try and stop places from being degraded, from losing their meaning. And I think conservation really does need to begin to think a little bit more consistently about loss, what it means, and what it involves. And for me, I use the phrase vulnerability. Conservation involves firstly understanding what we've got, secondly understanding why it's significant, but thirdly being very, very clear about how what is significant is vulnerable. On the left you've got Danson House in London. It's a typical example of what was a smaller country house which has now been surrounded by urban sprawl and development. And it does illustrate very much how the quality of places can gradually become eroded and encroached upon by planning decisions. And I think as conservationists we need to think a little bit more consistently and clearly about what is happening to the historic environment and how it is changing. That doesn't mean stopping change. We just need to understand what we're losing and whether or not, in the words of Peter Reed, it actually matters. One of the, for me, the most persistent sources of loss in the landscape has been open cast mining. My research was in the West Midlands, where I read and analysed and researched the landscapes there. And one would come across great swathes of landscape that had been, it's like sort of taking an eraser and kind of rubbing out a place. So open cast mining for me was a huge source of loss in the historic landscape. Forestry can equally be a source of loss and damage. Pollution. I've just come back from Australia, and we were down in southwest Tasmania in what was always cited as an extraordinary area of wilderness, but of course it is an area that has been managed for many thousands of years by local Aboriginal communities, which has been hugely devastated by the tailings from minerals. So another source of devastation and loss in the landscape is pollution. And there are many other sorts of loss. We've just undertaken a survey called MARS, Monuments at Risk Survey, where we have looked at some of the factors that are causing our monuments to be lost. So for the first time, we've actually looked systematically at the sort of things that are eroding monuments. Road building, mineral extraction, agriculture, actually, interestingly, is one of the largest sources of damage to the historic landscape. Visitor erosion, military things comes in some of demolition and building alteration is actually causing less damage than agriculture. This is one slide of a whole range of slides, and we've got a huge amount of data here. But what we're beginning to get is a very powerful tool which will help us to actually understand patterns of change and to be able to use that information in strategic planning decisions to actually influence how we think about the environment. And you can see also some of the data that's coming out of the landscape characterisation programme, where you can see in the map on the left in Nottinghamshire evidence for the loss of historic field boundaries. And we can plot those changes through time. So we're not just looking at present day loss, but we can look at patterns of loss in the past. Now, the advantage of understanding change and all its complexity is that it helps us to manage change. We don't have to say, no, we want to stop change. We simply have to say, look, let's look at patterns of change, levels of change, and work with them rather than against them. There are many other factors that contribute to loss and damage for historic landscapes, of which things like climate change, economic pressures, social pressures are all very important. We can also damage places through conservation. More than once I've come across individual landscapes where the ecologists have been saying one thing and the historic conservation people have been saying another thing. Give you a specific example, Capability Brown Lake, the conservationists want to go and dig it out. The ecologists say, but there is a wetland in there that's of value. This is a very small example of a very big issue, that conservation involves working with lots of different values, and sometimes it involves reconciling different values and managing conflict. So, right. So we've talked about the idea of historic environment, we've talked about the idea of meaning, and we've talked about the idea of vulnerability, that there are many, many different ways in which sites and places can be damaged. Which leaves us with the final issue of what is the new model of conservation? How do we conserve? How do we go forward? Well, we used to see conservation, as I say, as a very narrow issue. We would give people grants for perhaps creating new hedges, as at Stokesay Castle on the left, or grants for repairing ancient monuments. We were trying to sort of help people to actually maintain sites. But at the end of the day, this to some extent, and to be a little bit Australian about it, is very useful, it's very important, but it's also pissing in the wind. Because this is a very, very small part of the wider picture of what is happening to the landscape as a whole. If in conservation we are going to go beyond the very, very narrow world of fixing up monuments, we need to begin to look much more holistically at things. We need to operate on a bigger scale. We need to deal with bigger issues. And that's why our Historic Countryside Character programme is so very important. Because what we've been doing is we've been going around the country. I think we've done... Here we are. That's the map of, I think, the counties that have been done, and Graham tells me that there are rather more counties that are now black and rather more have been completed. So what we've been doing is undertaking countryside character mapping for huge swathes of the country, which means local authorities will have access to large-scale data about the character of whole areas, which is absolutely critical in things like mineral planning, housing planning, where we're going to put new housing, actually making decisions. You know, the last speaker showed us how architecture can take an idea of context on the scale of an individual site. This shows us how development can take account of context on a very, very much larger scale. So our historic character mapping work is really giving us a hugely powerful new tool which will enable us not to be reactive as we often have been, but in the driving seat, using understanding to drive change rather than reaction to drive change. Now, I've got my own guru. My guru happens to be an elderly quality assurance manager for Qantas, who subsequently went into conservation and produced this thing. He's a man called James Semple Kerr. He works and lives in Australia, and he's written a book called The Conservation Plan. It's a document that I've been using, selling and promoting for a long time, because what it does is provide an integrated approach to conservation which brings people together, makes people talk, and provides a common language. So a second aspect to a holistic solution to conservation is actually for different conservation professions to begin to come together, to actually talk, to share ideas, and to break down professional values. Professional barriers, sorry. I'm getting tired. And another example of this work is conservation issues in local plans, some work that we did with the Countryside Commission and English Nature, where again, different conservation professions were coming together to talk together to use an integrated approach rather than working separately. Two very, very powerful tools. But we as a conservation profession can probably just about reform ourselves. What we can't necessarily do alone is reform the rest of the country. And even if we do get our act together and do better conservation, there's still going to be a kind of so what to this. Pam Alexander, our chief executive, is absolutely famous for this phrase. Whenever we tell her anything, she says, so what? And she's right. It's actually a very good question. The so what for conservation is absolutely critical. Now, we have in the past, as I began, seen it as a fairly elitist, fairly narrow profession, fairly narrow set of issues affecting a fairly narrow set of society. But what we're beginning to realise is that the value of conservation is very, very, very much wider than I think any of us had ever really thought about. We've begun to realise that there are extraordinary economic benefits to conservation. Now, I think Peter Nixon may have talked about this yesterday, the very important work that the National Trust has been doing on the value of conserved landscapes in the southwest. Did he mention this? Right, where the National Trust have been looking at the jobs created by conserved landscapes, the spending created by conserved landscapes. If conservation of places brings genuine economic benefits, we are starting to be very much bigger players on the stage than we have been hitherto. So that's the first thing. Are there economic benefits to conservation? In English Heritage, we've been working on regeneration programs in inner cities, where we have demonstrated that conservation is not incompatible with regeneration, and in fact, that successful regeneration of places involves conservation. It means working with people, with their values, with their buildings, with their landscapes, with their open spaces, with the things that matter to them. We used to have a model in the 60s of regeneration that involved sweeping away town centres. We've now realised that it doesn't succeed. So conservation and regeneration, conservation and economics go together. There's another interesting government buzzword, competitiveness. We're seeking to build a competitive environment, a competitive economy. If you think about the competitiveness of Britain, one of the advantages that Britain has is in its historic environment. The places, whether it's Cambridge, Brighton, landscapes, the places that can make bits of Britain good places to live, can also, in, as you said, a new technological world where people can work anywhere, do potentially create a competitive advantage. Now, if we can persuade the government that conservation creates a competitive advantage, again, we're suddenly very much bigger and very much more serious players than we have been hitherto. I've also talked earlier about social benefits. One of the bases of the whole sustainable development idea is that the environment contributes fundamentally. Not, we don't just save animals because we want to save animals and because we really want to be nice about elephants. What the environment does is it contributes fundamentally to the quality of our life. Now, if you think about it, the historic environment has a huge impact on the quality of life. If, as we saw with Georgian Gardens, the historic environment is a source of identity, if the historic environment is what makes places comfortable, interesting, accessible, then the historic environment is playing a role in the quality of life, and therefore potentially in social life as well as in economic life. There are actually social benefits to conservation. So these two things, the economic benefits of conservation and the social benefits of conservation, are terribly important arguments. If we can demonstrate that conservation can bring both of those, then we can also demonstrate that conservation is a mainstream activity and not a narrow sectoral activity, and it is something that needs to cut across all areas of government and public policy and life. It is not just a matter for English Heritage or the Countryside Commission, but it is a matter for the Ministry of Defence. It is a matter for the Treasury. It is a matter for the environment as a whole. And in that way, conservation suddenly becomes a very, very much bigger issue than it has hitherto. So, there is a potential new vision for conservation, something that's moved from being a very narrow elitist thing, that's something that's much more central to all of us. If we are going to go that way, those of us who are involved in conservation have got to get our acts together. We've got to work together, we've got to stop having petty, separate professional disputes. We need some common ideas, some common approaches, and as I say, we need to sort of pull together. So for me, if you like, a holistic approach to conservation is a very simple one, it's a very clear one, and it's one that I hope that we can all begin to sign up for. First of all, if we are to become more socially relevant, more economically relevant, we've got to move away from individual monuments towards, I think, the idea of a historic environment that's very close and interlinked with the idea of a natural environment. We can no longer draw boundaries around things. Secondly, we need to rethink our basic definition for conservation. Now, we can slog this one out for some time, but to my mind, it's about passing on what we value, and value is at the heart of it, to future generations. Now, the advantage of this definition is very, very close to the one that the natural environment people use for sustainability. So we're already using the same language, the same approaches, the same tools. We're talking together. In the conservation planning work that I've been doing, I've realised that there is a very, very common thread that runs through the conservation process, wherever we are, whoever we are, whatever profession we've been in. For me, it begins with understanding. Now, whether that understanding is the countryside character map, or the countryside, I mustn't say countryside, the character maps that we've been developing for the whole of Britain, or the understanding that I've been doing as part of conservation plans, we've got to start by knowing what is there. Far too often we leap in with 2 feet, assuming. The second aspect, part of the process, is we need to understand why things matter. Far too often we assume we know why things matter. One of the reasons why we've been so narrow as a profession is we have, if you like, been the dictators who have told people why things matter. That means listening to people and learning. I think we need to learn from the ecologist and think more about vulnerability to understand what is happening to our resource, to understand whether we're focusing on the right things or not. And finally, we need to not stop change, but actually manage change, because that's what we're all about. And this sort of process is entirely compatible with creative new design. This is the basis for good new design. Every new building occurs in a place that exists. If we understand that place, what it is, why it matters, and how it's vulnerable, the potential for doing something new is very much stronger. Often, I think, conservation and new design have become enemies because people have been afraid of understanding places. People haven't stopped to understand places. They haven't read places. They've just come in with a set of imposed values. So for me, more articulate conservation is the basis for more articulate creativity and new design. It's an interesting game to play. While I was listening to some of the other papers, I was beginning to try and think about, the old version of conservation and the new vision of conservation to sort of see how we're moving. So we've sort of moved away from this idea of isolated monuments and buildings, single species, towards this more general idea of historic environment, of place, of context, of habitat. It's a very common thread here. In why we conserve, I think we've moved away from this sort of, the scientific in ecology, style attribution, connoisseurship, academic values, national importance, the sort of special, towards much broader ideas of significance, multiple voices for the past, multiple values for the past, and the idea of meaning, the recognition that things can be important if they're local and typical, as well as if they're nationally important. I think we've also widened, I didn't really fill this in, and I wasn't quite sure what to put, but I think that, for whom we are conserving is important. I think we're beginning to realise that we're conserving for a very much wider audience. And I think in how we conserve, we're moving away from this kind of top-down, separate systems, this idea that we restore, towards very much more bottom-up, integrated conservation approaches. Regeneration is perhaps rather better than restoration. A recognition that we're managing change rather than stopping change. I like the idea that we're moving from being dictators to being facilitators. As somebody who's an ex-inspector of ancient monuments, this has got a certain charm to it. And to a much more inclusive and, I hope, creative approach. But when I wrote these two columns, I thought, well, hang on, because in fact they're not in opposition. If you look at the history of conservation, it's always cumulative. Each generation tends to conserve more and to be interested in more. And I think rather than seeing these two approaches as it being in opposition, I think what we're doing is just adding, and that's why I wrote the pluses on the bottom, we're kind of adding a new layer to conservation, a new dimension to conservation, which I hope won't throw away the best of the baby in what we did do, but will, I'm having trouble with bathwater and plugs and babies here, but we can keep the bathwater and the baby. I don't think we should throw away the whole of the past, but I think we can add to it and increase it. And if we do that, we begin to create something which I hope will demonstrate that what we do is actually very, very important and is actually a central part of economy and society. Oh, this is just a couple of slides of conservation plans, the approaches that I've been using. A very flexible approach to conservation. I'm put in a free advertisement here. You can use it on anything from a ship to a landscape. Okay, so at the end of the day, conservation is not about creating museum chocolate box Britain. We're tarred with this brush the whole time, and I'm absolutely fed up with it. I think we're moving well beyond this to a much more inclusive version of conservation that's about places, that's about different values, that's much, much wider, and I hope very much more relevant. And just to finish off with, I did want to show this. I want to leave you with what for me has been a very important lesson in conservation and what it could be and where it could go. At the beginning of the talk, I said that we can learn from other people in other countries. I have to tell you that I think the English are very arrogant about conservation. They tend to assume that they invented it and there's nobody that they need to learn from. I've just come back from South Africa, where I've been working with the staff at Robben Island Museum. Robben Island, for me, throws every conservation nostrum on its head. The site is most important for its most recent history, and that's the imprisonment of Nelson Mandela there over the last 20 years. So what's most important about that site is not old, even though it is a very old site. It's actually quite recent. If you go to South Africa, Robben Island is a hugely important symbol of a whole social movement, of a whole country. And in South Africa, the conservation of that island is a very central concern. Everybody debates it, everybody's interested in it, everybody wants to go there, everybody wants to see it. And for me, it demonstrates that places have extraordinary meanings. It's not just a prison. I mean, you tend to assume Robben Island is a prison, but what you actually have is a landscape. If any of you have seen the play The Island, that was recently playing at the National, where two prisoners on Robben Island are working in the quarry, you realise that the landscape around those buildings is as important and has such deep embedded memories in it for the people who were there that it matters every bit as much as the buildings. And equally, of course, it's an ecological site. But for me, I suppose, Robben Island, more than anything, has shown the way conservation is going. New values, new audiences, new people, but the same basic message that embedded in the fabric of the past are things that matter to all of us. And I think that if conservation is about that, it's going to bring huge social and economic benefits. Thank you very much indeed. debate.
Off you go.
Staggered us. It's taken English heritage so long. And well, when you talk about old conservation, I wondered if you knew how many of the phrases were used that either Octavia Hill, Canon Rawnsley, John Ruskin, or William Morris would have said. Guardians of Change is John Ruskin. It is his century this year. And all these things that we now think of as holistic, they knew, and all these words that are now tossed around, social inclusion, local distinctiveness, sustainability, read your Ruskin, they're all there. They knew about it. But if I may just say what happened, there was this wonderful amenity movement of following on all their ideas about the beauty of the world and what we should be doing. And then the amenity societies all start out as CPRE 1926, and so we go on, H1 before that. And everybody felt, well, what they'd have to do was to have statutory protection after the war, that they were never going to get anywhere because the bylaws weren't doing anything. But what, unfortunately, we didn't realise about statutory protection was it also brought bureaucracy. And now what we've got to go back to are those clarion calls of Ruskin and Morris. And the people knew. They use the word quality of life too all the time, every other sentence of Morris and so on. People are all fighting their own patches today. We've got so many different bits that Gardens or Victorian has and so on. We've all tended to specialise, whereas when the amenity movement began, they did see it holistic. And I can only say thank you so much for taking us back 100 years before we got bureaucracy.
Well, you're absolutely right. And I've just fished out a wonderful phrase from William Morris about, we not only in his address to the SPAB AGM in 1877 about, holding these buildings in, custodians, which I've tried to get into the recent Heritage Review. Whether it'll survive the editors, I don't know. But I know that you're absolutely right, that going back to Morris and Ruskin is a very, very salutary lesson, and you sometimes wonder how far we've got. And one of the issues that is being debated as part of the current Heritage Review is exactly the point that you've raised, which is, should we abandon designation completely and work towards a sort of single philosophical approach for looking at the impact of any proposal in any aspect of the planning system on the special interest of the site? But it's a frightening thing to do that. And what it means is that we need far more skills and resources in local authorities, I think.
But we're also grateful for what your Graham Fairclough's department and so on section have been doing, but it's been a long time for poor Graham's work has been, having been on his original historic landscape and appreciating very much his approach. It never seemed to get written up by English Heritage, but so thank heavens for the review.
Many of us have been followers of Graham for many years. I mean, there is followers of the One True Way. And no, to be fair, I think that the Heritage Review is going to bring a lot of these issues out into the open. I think it's a timely review, and I think that the value of characterisation is certainly something that will be debated.
Well done, anyhow.
Point of clarification. Can you clarify the relationship between the historic character mapping that English Heritage is doing and the Countryside Agency's character area?
No, you have to ask Graham.
Okay.
Sorry. No, I'll only get the answer to that wrong. I mean, I've got the publications with me, and you can certainly look at the data, but I'd have to double check with Graham what the precise on-the-ground relationship between the two is. I'm pretty sure that they're working very closely together. I mean, the whole work came out of Graham's own work with the Countryside Commission. So I don't think there's any incompatibility there at all.
Are those areas taken county by county or region by region? So one sees possibly a more useful approach regional and get a wider picture.
The magic of computers is you can do regions, and you can do counties, and you can do areas, and you can do districts. I think they're being driven at county level at the moment primarily because it's the county archaeological units who have sites and monuments, records and data for landscapes that are, in the best position to drive the work. But there is no reason why you can't bring them together. And indeed, I think with the new regional level of government, we're trying to influence some of their strategies by putting together regional strategies. So the data can easily be used at a regional level and aggregated.
Well, I suppose we can take silence for consensus.
Or significant doubt.
No, there is not complete consensus. Elizabeth.
I may not be able to reach the back of the room, we're still so full here.
Pass the instrument.
I made the right decision yesterday when I was speaking to not talk about historic preservation, because you've done such a wonderful job of characterizing the situation. I guess what I'd just like to add is an American perspective on the decision you face now. It's a twofold decision you mentioned. And one is the issue of moving from national to a more universal, local, regional, national significance level in a designation kind of process. And as you may know, the United States, the National Register for Historic Places, it is called the National Register, but it does list sites, objects, districts, buildings, and structures of local, state, and national significance. And they're assigned that level of significance, and we try not to play games with whether that means they get more attention or less, okay? And it assigns them a level of attention in especially federal programs, and there's whole problems with the federal system because it was designed back in the 1960s when we were having the downtown removals just as you all did them, only worse. We, of course, Americans have a larger scale country, so we did larger scale
Big
things.
machines.
But the problems that we face now in the preservation of historic fabric and the historic environment, as you've defined it, I certainly accept that and applaud it, is really more to do with individual and corporate decisions on how to manage change in their own lights. And so there's really no getting around the issue that you have to get into the planning aspects of it. And so I realize it's a daunting decision on your part, and however you choose to do it, with or without designation, I think one of the flaws in the historic preservation system in the United States is that we have thought that we're fairly comfortable off to one side, having our nice little system with our nice little federal review process, and it's really, really hurt us not to be right in at the elbow level with everybody else, trying to get our values into those planning decisions. And so I know that's a huge resource issue for you, but I just encourage you in that.
It's a big jump to take.
Right. Oh, one more.
I just add one comment there. I was interested in the idea of regional or local or county, and I'm thinking as a sort of landscape architect, I'm thinking, is there a systems-based way of looking at mapping character or looking at value of landscape? For example, just one example springs to mind. If you look at the map of Britain's rivers and their watershed, which is cross-county and regional boundaries sometimes, that sets this is the sort of the watershed and water management system for a zone, which may cross cities or different regional zones. And that is the thing that sustains and supports the natural system on top of that, into which we cultivate and shift the ground and make it cultivate the wilderness, basically. And I suppose I'm thinking that that's a kind of local, well, the national perspective perhaps. But then I also wonder, I'm thinking back to Florian's presentation, where he's looking at a despoiled landscape, a landscape that has perhaps absorbed the maximum abuse that it could have done in one respect. And while we can value that on a cultural level, is there something about thinking about how that continues, and whether I'm just thinking about his highly aestheticized way of approaching that, very, very responsive to the spatiality of the place. But I'm also wondering about, I suppose, the sustainability and the future of that place and its ability to support life. And I suppose from a global perspective, and perhaps I'm preempting the next speaker, I don't know, I'm wondering about that, which we haven't touched on so much over the 2 days. How is it working from a sustainability approach? So I wonder if there's this kind of, I suppose coming back to my main point, this cross-regional way of looking, which may influence conservation, but it will influence all of us as planners, designers, people producing policy. I guess it's going back to the point of the last speaker, before Elizabeth, who was thinking back to Ruskin and Thoreau, maybe. But the way in which we attach value.
There's two things. I mean, the pragmatic thing about the character work is that the character work has no boundaries. Everywhere has character. So you're part of the business of sort of cross-regional issues is that if you assume that everywhere has character, you don't have to draw lines around region and says this is one region, this is the other. But it also means that you anticipate that everywhere does have character. Do you see what I mean? So you have to go and look for it.
But I suppose the way that we operate, the way we're moving forward is we assess the value in order to make moves, in order to make change and to shift and shape landscape in whatever form. We have some attitude towards that value. We can define character. We may not all agree on it, but we have to process that in order to be able to make a move within the landscape, whatever scale, whatever level.
Yeah.
So I think we can't be disassociated. We can map it as an exercise, but in terms of shifting and shaping and making futures, and I guess that includes programmatic elements, how do we want to live, etc. It's a big question, really.
I have no simple answer to that, but on the work that we've been doing on conservation plans, where the second stage of the conservation plan is to define significance, we've been wrestling and grappling with this. You know, what is the significance of a site, to whom, to what, and at what level? There's the wonderful Clay Mathers thing on trends and significance. Do you know the document? The American Corps of Military Engineers have kind of been trying to map significance, you know, giving everything, because they're army officers, they like to give everything scores and, you know, boxes. And so, you know, one aspect of the world is trying to score significance, which is a very scary, dangerous thing to do.
But they're also attaching values to that. For example, in the Mississippi,
yes,
they're deciding that the river shouldn't flood, so they spend millions of pounds on defences, and yet the Mississippi floods pretty much every year and destroys a lot of cultivation. And
CF Egypt and a number of other countries. Yeah.
And it's sort of like, I don't know. I mean, we're getting onto kind of bigger issues in a way, or.
All I can say is that, I mean, I think what you've asked is a really very, very central question. If conservation is based on significance, who and how do we define significance? Now, you can either throw up your hands and say, hey, it's all relative, or it's all too difficult, or you can sit down, take a deep breath, and actually try and do it. And that's what this conservation planning process is about. And the wonderful thing about Jim's text is he says, you know, for each site it's different. I mean, we're talking about individual sites here rather than entire river basins. But I think there are some important lessons here. Because what he says is, you know, take each site as it comes, use the right techniques, the right criteria for the right decisions that you have to make. The important thing is that you try and tackle significance rather than assume. And I think that's probably, I mean, there's a whole fantastic seminar to be done, if anybody's got any time, on significance, how we define it, because it's a huge and interesting question. Sorry, yeah.
The Norwich River Valley, which is a project which what it does is takes partnerships across the boundaries of the various local authorities that surround the city and its surroundings, and that's the approach we're taking, to take a whole group of local authorities, interests like the Broads and various other local interests, and that's how we're taking it forward, using the landscape character map, actually the Countryside Agency one.
Right.
as a basis to then set a benchmark for what is there and then take that forward as a group. But it's quite a difficult activity to work with all those people, and that's
It is.
You know, something that
Which is why I use the phrase moving from being dictators to facilitators, because if as professionals we are no longer dictating value, which is what we have done in the past, but trying to listen to what those values are, then we need a whole new range of skills. And the people who've taught me most about this are the people who've been working with Indigenous communities in Northern Australia, who have been forced to learn to work with very, very different cultural values in order to make things happen. And I think there's a lesson there for all of us that, you know, we have to learn to listen to, and perhaps our job is more to articulate value than dictate it. I mean, again, I haven't answered your question because you're still saying, you know, whose values when and where, but at least we try.
I hope we'll have further opportunity for discussion when we come to sum up and evaluating what we've been listening to today. But I'm afraid, have we got Martin Williams? Good. I thought I saw you steal in, and my heart rose. So could you come up, please, and we'll get on to the next session. So if you will introduce yourself, that's great. He will introduce himself at the top.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, my name is Martin Williams. I'm the Senior Parliamentary Campaigner at Friends of the Earth. I've been at Friends of the Earth for probably 5 years or so now, in various capacities, always working within the parliamentary unit. It's a slightly strange job being in the parliamentary unit. It's not like the other people you see on television from Friends of the Earth who are all experts on one particular thing, whether it be sort of transport or industrial pollution or whatever it is. I'm not an expert on any of those things, and I hope you're not going to come up with technical questions at the end. What I do have, though, is a very broad overview, because it's my job to push the whole of Friends of the Earth's agenda through Parliament and try and promote legislation and promote changes to legislation which will help Friends of the Earth achieve our goals through the whole of the parliamentary process. So it does give me quite a broad overview, and I've worked on a number of issues which will, I think, be quite relevant to today, particularly really transport and energy efficiency and housing. I think those are two very important issues for the future, and the provision of housing, provision of high quality housing. And those are two issues which I think are going to have a very major impact on our landscape. Now, what I intended to talk about was to begin with the usual environmentalist bit of doom and gloom. I thought I could go through the threats to our environment, both in our urban environments and in our rural areas in this country, and then actually just widen that out a little bit, because the way that we live in our urban areas and in our rural areas in this country does also have major environmental impacts for the whole of the rest of the globe, and I think that we can't consider the future landscape in this country without considering those as well. I'd then like to set out the principles that FO believes should be applied when we're seeking solutions to those problems. Just three very basic principles, which I will come to in the middle, and then to come forward with some ideas for solutions and also something of a challenge to you for how you might help and might help take this agenda forward. So to begin with the best bit, the doom and gloom, the bit we're all very good at in the environmental movement. Our countryside is under massive threat at the minute from development, from increasing traffic levels, from requirements for new housing, from requirements for new supermarkets and new out-of-town industrial parks and all sorts of other issues which are being tried to be forced into our greenfield sites. Our countryside is also threatened by unsustainable agricultural practices. Modern farming methods are more and more reliant on chemicals, and the impacts on our wildlife have been extremely severe over the last 20, 30 years. Many of the species that I'm sure many of us would remember from our younger days have been absolutely decimated within the wildlife. Tree sparrow populations have dropped by 87% since 1972. That's a bird which I remember seeing all the time as a kid, but I mean, grey partridges, another one which perhaps you don't see quite so often, but they're down by 78% in the same period. In fact, a couple of years back, the RSPB counted the population of all sorts of birds, and they found dramatic declines in a single year across many bird species. Cuckoos, for example, were down 33% that year. Now, there's always some natural variation. These numbers will go up and down, but there has been a sustained and prolonged fall in populations of birds and all sorts of other wild animals that live in our countryside. Unsustainable agriculture has been one of the major forces killing off this wildlife. The increasing mechanisation of farming has led to more and more dependence on chemicals for pesticides, for food, killing pests and for killing weeds, and of course for actually fertilising the soil as well. Now, these chemicals can persist in our food. We find pesticide residues in an alarming percentage of the food on sale in supermarkets. They pollute our waters. We may not realise it, but we pay a huge bill every year for cleaning contaminants out of the water, which are just left there from our farming processes. We don't notice it because it's not itemised on our bill. It's just part of our water bill, but there's billions of pounds a year spent on the plants and the equipment to remove those things. They have a dramatic effect on the natural food chain and therefore an impact on our wildlife. They also have an impact on our food itself. We've seen increasing food scares. We've seen BSE, salmonella in eggs, E. coli outbreaks, the latest GM scares. It shows how they have an impact in other ways as well. There are potential dangers for all people who are eating the food which are produced on these increasingly intensified farms. And physical factors within those intensive farms have also made a big difference as well. The grubbing up of hedgerows so that farmers have bigger fields which are more accessible to be harvested more easily has destroyed habitats which many farmland species used to depend on. Now we see GM foods, a further development in the mechanisation of our countryside. Now, this isn't the occasion to go into whether or not the genetic modification of crops is right or wrong, but I think it is worth saying that there's one thing worth remembering, and that's that Monsanto and the other people who are producing these new crops are only aiming at one thing. They want a more efficient crop, and from the point of view of what we're talking about today, the most efficient crop they could possibly develop would be one that nothing ate except humans, and nothing grew in the same field as it except for that crop. And as I say, like genetic modification or don't like genetic modification, that's clearly the direction the market is driving these companies in. That's the direction they want to go to have the competitive edge over their other companies. That's what's happening. Now, from a wildlife point of view, if we have crops where nothing else grows in the field except that crop and nothing can eat it except us, we have a field that is as useful to wildlife as actually a huge concrete car park or something. I mean, there is no benefit for wildlife in that area at all. So nothing to do with the rights and wrongs of the actual genetic modification. The increasing intensification which GM crops indicates is actually a further disaster for our wildlife. At the same time as our farmland is being degraded by these practices, it's also under pressure for new housing development and from new roads. The expectation that hundreds of thousands more homes will be built in greenfield areas means the further loss of countryside and the loss of more of our wildlife's habitats. New towns and developments which are planned are also going to be a source of more traffic, and that traffic will add to the already intense pressure for more roads in our countryside. The British Roads Federation claims there's 600 communities up and down the country who believe that they need a bypass in order to alleviate the traffic problems that they have in their towns. 600 roads is an unbelievable number of roads, both from our taxpayers' bill for actually building them, and also for the sort of devastation that would cause. But that's the level of pressure for new roads at the moment, and with new communities around and more traffic, particularly as most of the new developments that we're seeing are so car-dependent and so dispersed, suburban-type developments, the pressure will grow still greater. And as well as the loss of the land itself, these new roads and these new houses have a wider impact on our countryside. New developments can have huge water requirements, which can be obtained to a certain extent by pumping water from boreholes. But this can depress the water table. When the water table depresses, then local streams and other wetland areas can dry out. And again, those wetland areas can be crucial for local wildlife. The noise from a new road can actually prevent birds breeding for up to 600 yards on each side of the road. The birds rely on song and so on for their mating rituals. If they can't hear them because of the drone of the road, it actually puts a sterile strip, perhaps as much as 1,200 yards on, or 600 yards each side of the road, but straight through our countryside. So you're actually affecting a far greater area than simply the area of the road itself. Furthermore, the runoff that you get from roads, the rainwater runoff, is contaminated with little rubber fragments from tyres and with brake dust from the brake linings of cars, and with leaks of oil and petrol and diesel and so on, which have leaked from the engine onto the road. So again, you have sudden imposition of a great deal of sort of toxic material into the water along the edges of those roads. All that building of roads and houses also requires aggregates and building materials, so there's further pressure for quarrying, and once you've had quarrying, as most people know who live anywhere near a quarry, you've then got the next worry of landfill. Once the quarry's finished, you seem to end up with a landfill site next to you more often than not. Again, a way to dispose of the waste which we're all producing all the time, maybe, but a serious toxic pollutant threat for the local area. In our urban areas, we see them becoming more and more polarised. I mean, I live in central London, and I see many of the new developments in sort of Hackney and Islington area where I live, old warehouses being redeveloped and so on, but they build them all like fortresses these days. They have major locks on the outside and gates which can only be accessed by people. They usually have a sort of drive-in car park underneath them, which again is triggered by someone's little infrared beeper thing that they press on their way up to the gate. They are fortress-like, and it's hardly surprising, because some of these places on the outskirts of Islington and getting into Hackney are only yards from dreadful-looking council estates with run-down housing and graffiti and broken bottles all over the place and crime problems, huge unemployment problems, all the rest of the problems which we associate with urban squalor. And you can quite imagine that the young professional people moving into these new factory blocks are going to be quite affected by those neighbours and are going to want that security fitted in. Yet, that grotty council estate right next door to these new developments highlights another problem that we have, which is the appalling quality of much of our housing stock. I don't know if you will be surprised to know that every winter, approximately 30 to 60,000 more people die during 4 months of winter than do in any sort of 4-month period in the rest of the year. That is it's about a 30% increase on the death rate for the rest of the year, which is probably 3 times the increase you see anywhere else in the rest of Europe, even in places like Sweden and Norway, where the climate is actually far colder. The reason for that is our houses are so poor, they're badly insulated, they're damp, people literally cannot keep warm in their homes, and while they don't die of hypothermia in huge numbers, that does usually make the paper, there's usually only a couple of hundred hypothermia deaths each year, what they do die of is increased numbers of heart attacks and increased incidence of things like bronchitis and pneumonia, which are all affected by cold and damp housing. There's 1.5 million homes in this country unfit for habitation, according to the last English House Condition Survey. And other work has showed that looking at poor families' homes in Glasgow, Edinburgh and London, up to a third of the people living in them had damp problems, damp on the wall. And in fact, half of the houses that were looked at in that survey had mould growing on the walls. Mould affects all sorts of respiratory illnesses, not least asthma, which is a serious problem for children. There's actually huge swathes of some of our northern cities which have been all but abandoned. I don't know if people watch Newsnight, but the regular reports that Newsnight have been doing ever since the Labour government came to power, looking at 2 estates in Salford, has shown more and more of these northern streets, more and more of the houses being sold off and people being isolated in them, the houses remaining empty. And there's all sorts of urban myths about you buy one, get one free if you buy a house on a certain street up in Salford and so on. It is a very, very serious problem. And the knock-on effects, the social effects of the unemployment, of the state of the educational facilities in those areas, of the fact that actually the only middle-class people who do live in a particular area and send their children to the local school end up moving out or sending their child into the private sector to avoid the local school, leads to further isolation and further polarisation of our urban environment. We also have the transport problems in urban areas. I don't need to tell anyone about that, and particularly not anyone from London. Massive congestion problems, pollution, noise, all exacerbate health problems. Things like asthma, bronchitis, again, affected by the pollution which comes from road transport. A government committee calculated that up to 24,000 deaths every year are brought forward by just the 5 main pollutants from road traffic. The other minor pollutants probably do more as well. But that's 24,000 deaths a year. It's the kind of figure you expect to hear in some chemical accident in India or something. It's not something that you believe would go on year in this country. People without cars in cities actually find themselves isolated. As we've become more and more dependent on out-of-town supermarkets and out-of-town facilities, which are not easily accessible unless you have a car, people find it more and more difficult to buy fresh food or to find access to leisure facilities or even just to visit their friends. There's a new phrase which has been bandied around over the last couple of years by public health experts of food deserts. And these are areas in city centres where it's actually easier to buy a McDonald's than it is to buy a fresh apple. There are simply not the shops in many of these areas for people to purchase fresh and nutritious food. The social networks, which it's recognised are very important for maintaining good social relationships in the area, keeping crime down, actually very good for people's mental health as well. Having a good network of social contacts makes people far more resistant to many of the mental illnesses which are suffered in this country, are destroyed by busy roads. There's been studies done in San Francisco looking at how many social interactions there are on streets with light traffic, medium traffic and heavy traffic. And again, it shows time and time again, the evidence shows that on the heavy trafficked areas, social interaction breaks down, there's social disintegration, there's also all of the problems which we see in our inner cities. children are becoming obese. They don't get the exercise because they're not allowed to play outside anymore because the roads are too dangerous. Because so few people are playing outside, there's also the fear of stranger danger, a problem which I suppose has always been around, but is exacerbated when there are less and less children out on the road. Very few children cycle or walk to school anymore. If I ever got picked up by my mum from school, I was embarrassed. I used to want her to pick me up around the corner, whereas now something like 10% of children make their way to school on their own. The rest are taken either by their parents and usually in a car. The kids find themselves cooped up in their homes, and then they get demonised for playing computer games, which I've always thought is most unfair. These children have been referred to as battery kids, cooped up in little boxes, unable to get out and enjoy the fresh air and play outside. It's also the case that these poorer children, or these children in the poorer areas of town, find themselves about 8 times more likely to be hit and killed by a car than children in the richer parts of town. Again, it's because poorer families live on the busier roads, because poorer families are more likely to be walking in the street, while the richer families are more likely to be driving down them in their cars, I suppose, running them over. But we have the worst pedestrian death rate in Europe. There's over 200 children killed every year on our roads, and there's thousands more injured. And traffic volume and speed have been time and time again shown to be the most important factors in this. The other problems we have in our cities, particularly in some of the southeastern cities, is the problem of affordable housing. Essential workers are finding it more and more difficult to live in areas like London, and being forced to live further and further out of London and commute in, which again adds stress and adds difficulty for them. That's just a small handful of the problems that we face in our urban areas, but there's wider problems as well. The way that we live now threatens our wider environment, indeed our global environment. Pollution doesn't know any boundaries. It doesn't stop in this country or stop in London or anything else. It does affect the whole globe. And our current lifestyle is placing a serious burden on the whole globe. Climate change is probably the best known and probably the most serious threat that faces our planet. It's caused by the emission of greenhouse gases like carbon dioxide and methane and so on, gases which are created when we use energy. It threatens to destabilize the entire planetary climate. There is overwhelming evidence and enormous acceptance by scientists that climate change, man-made climate change, is a very serious and real problem. There are 1 or 2 skeptics still around, but they really are very, very much in the minority. Bangladesh could be entirely flooded, with the impact that would have on the huge population there. Places like the Maldives could actually disappear below the sea completely within 20 or 30 years. Extreme weather events would threaten disasters across the world, from floods to tornadoes to mudslides and so on. And just even without the extreme weather events, which are predicted to increase should the climate continue to change in the way it is doing, the shifting patterns of climate would also have massive impacts on crop production across the world. Our biodiversity is being devastated across the world as well. The number of animals and the wildlife that we're losing. We're ploughing down rainforests, we're killing off sea areas through pollution, we're overfishing sea stocks. That's another huge problem. At the minute, it is calculated that the current rate of extinction of species in the world is running at between 5 and 100 times the expected average rate of extinction. There is obviously a continuous extinction of species and the evolution of new species, but we are far outstripping what would be anticipated to be the natural rate. And in fact, it could be that we're moving on to what you might call a mass extinction. If you look back through the geological record, at times like when the dinosaurs all died off, those episodes are known as mass extinctions. So it's difficult to know whether the dinosaurs died off overnight or over a period of a couple of thousand years. But certainly if the current rates continue they are at the moment for a couple hundred more years, we are looking at mass extinction scale. There is persistent pollution. In the production of goods we use, chemicals like dioxins are produced. And they've been found in the blubber of seals in the Arctic. They've been found thousands and thousands of miles from any factory. It's what's known as bioaccumulation. These chemicals can accumulate in particular body parts of particular animals and persist and have terrible effects on animals and on people as well if they're relying on eating the seals up in the northern parts of Canada and so on. Other chemicals, such as hormone mimicking chemicals or gender benders, are changing the sex of fish and actually having an impact on estuary birds. I think probably Friends of the Earth's best ever press release went out after we discovered that birds who lived on an estuary in Hartlepool were actually showing signs of mutating to the opposite sex because of the amount of hormone mimicking chemicals they were eating through eating the fish in the estuary. It was in Peter Mandelson's constituency. We managed to get a press release out that said, Mendelssohn's birds in sex change shocker. So, but it is a very serious problem. For future, we have nuclear pollution to worry about. We all know about the long-lasting nature of nuclear pollution. And of course, going back to genetically modified foods again, genetic pollution could be another problem, which is extremely difficult to control and recall once it's out there. We have problems with the resources that we use through mining right across the world, through the use of rainforests and wood and all sorts of other resources. We are causing real problems by extracting far more from the earth than it can actually sustain. Now that brings me on to the three principles that Friends of the Earth would want to see applied to any solutions. The first solution, or the first principle, is the principle of ecological limits. Gandhi is actually reported to have said that it took the exploitation of half the globe to make Britain what it is. How many globes could it take for India to do the same? Now, that was said quite a long time ago, before the idea of environmental space, which I think is a terribly clumsy label, had really been sort of worked through, but it does very neatly explain exactly what environmental space is all about. People are familiar with the idea that we're going to run out of oil if we use too much because there's only a limited amount out there. But environmental space is slightly more complex than that, because it, as well as just actually when will we use up all the resources, it also looks at other systems and the capacity of other systems to absorb the abuse that we're dishing out to it. So, for example, climate. We know that we can put a certain amount of carbon dioxide into the air, which will raise the climate by a certain number of degrees centigrade without it doing too much damage. But if we go too far and the climate rises too far, then we will suffer all sorts of catastrophes as a result. So we can try to put environmental limits on other things rather than just resource use. And the same thing with the ability of nature to break down things like oil slicks. Oil slicks are eventually broken down by bacteria, and they're eaten by algae and so on. And they gradually, the world can get back to sort of normal after a terrible oil slick, and the wildlife will recover. But if we have too many oil slicks, then we'll overwhelm that natural system for the clean-up of oil, and we will not be able to cope with that. So the idea is that we put together these ideas of environmental space and express them in terms of the number of Earths it would take to get everybody in the world, all countries in the world, up to the same levels of consumption and energy use as we have in this country. Now, when we do that, Friends of the Earth have spent a lot of time working on this. They've come up with these figures, let's say, expressed as Gandhi suggests, as how many globes, and we find that we would need 8 Earths to actually produce and use the amount of energy which we use in this country for everybody in the world. It would take 3.5 Earths just to meet our cement demand, and 2 Earths to meet our aggregates demand. It'd take more than 8 Earths for aluminium and about 5 Earths for steel, and even good old sort of eco-friendly renewable wood, which you think you could grow in more forests, would actually need 4 Earths to supply all the wood that we need. That would actually need 1.5 Earths just to supply the land that we live on, so that would be a problem in itself. Now, it's figures like these that lead Foe to believe there are limits. They are imposed upon us by the environmental system in which we live. They're not things that we can ignore, because if we do ignore them, we push these systems beyond their capacity to cope, and we face the catastrophic consequences. It isn't simply running out of materials, it is destabilising all sorts of other environmental systems which do actually billions of pounds worth of good to us, whether it be holding back floods, whether it be providing wood, providing oxygen, or whatever. The second principle is fairness, and that everybody should be entitled to the same amount of the Earth's resources as each other. Obviously, we wouldn't need 8 Earths if it's only Britain that carries on using resources at the rate it does, and we stop everybody else from having any sort of electric light in their home or fridges or whatever. But Friends of the Earth wouldn't consider that to be just, and therefore we believe that everybody's entitled to their fair share of the Earth's resources. And then I think the final word is, it's an even worse and clumsier term than environmental space, but it's known as futurity, which is that simple concept that we do need to hand on to our children, or we believe that it is right to hand on to our children, a world that is at least as good as the one that we've got at the minute. We don't want to prejudice their lives on our Earth through careless use of resources and careless pollution during our lives. So, trying to find solutions which those 3 principles apply to and which solve some of the problems I've raised, I think there is no doubt for a start that cities and urban areas are going to be a massive part of that solution. 90% of us in the UK live in urban areas, and they do enable us to use our environmental space, as it's called, far more efficiently. They make things like public transport possible. I mean, it just wouldn't be possible to run public transport in some very remote areas. In the higher density populations of cities, they are viable, they can work. It makes things like water provision and schooling so much more straightforward to produce for people, and hygiene and so on, which has made such advances over the last 100 years, is possible in cities in a way that it's far more difficult to carry out in a dispersed population. Yet Richard Rogers says that we are 20 years behind other European cities such as Amsterdam and Barcelona in the way that we plan and design our cities. We know the problems we have, and we hear from every government, governments of every colour and political parties of every colour, about the importance of regeneration of our cities. So how can we do it? One of the things Richard Rogers also says is that regeneration must be design-led. I presume by that he just means worked out and planned, as opposed to the laissez-faire policies of perhaps the previous government, certainly under Margaret Thatcher and Keith Joseph. And I think there's no doubt about that at all. We've seen the damage that out-of-town facilities have done to our town centres. We've seen the way that out-of-town supermarkets and other facilities have led to further dependence on the car, and the way that further dependence on the car has led more and more people to abandon public transport, which has been more run down, and so the cycle goes on. I think we have a fairly good understanding of urban densities and the kind of densities that we need to make settlements in urban areas sustainable. Now, Faux believes that we should be trying to increase urban density to probably around 225 to 300 people per hectare. Perhaps in the central urban areas going a little bit higher, somewhere between 300 and 400 people per hectare. This is obviously well above the current suburban development we generally see, which is rarely above 100 people per hectare, and which is exactly the problem of car dependency and so on. Yet it's crucial. Public transport becomes viable really at about more than 100 people per hectare. We're currently consistently building below that. Walking to local services becomes far more viable at over 300 people per hectare. But these densities do not imply living in tower blocks or back-to-backs or any of the horrible things that we've seen in the past. We're talking about densities of 500 to 800 people per hectare. So we're not being hair-shirt about this. We're talking about something along the lines of Georgian or Victorian terraces of perhaps 3 or 4 stories high. The sort of housing which is actually very popular in urban areas anyway. And probably the most efficient sorts of housing in terms of both the heat requirements, because they have shared walls and they can be built very efficiently, and also the use of building materials. If we build higher and bigger buildings, we need more materials in order to reinforce the bottom floors, essentially. The idea is that 3 to 4 stories is probably about the ultimate. There's endless argument on that, which I can imagine. And yet, with all of these solutions, remember, it's not just environmental problems such as pollution and climate change that benefit. It's also all the other social problems that we've talked about, the accidents on the street, the social networks, the access to services for people living in those houses. Now, any homes which are built must be of the highest possible standards for energy efficiency. Our building regulations probably lag 30 years behind Sweden's. They are getting better, and modern houses are far more efficient than older houses. But modern designs like the passive house in Germany uses just about 8% of the heat of an average house and probably 25% of the electricity of an average house in this country. So there's still a huge way to go. We're lagging well behind that. We also need retrospective improvements. We need to improve the homes that we've got. It's a staggering fact that if we continue to demolish and rebuild at the same rate as we're doing now, by the time we've actually knocked down all of our existing housing stock, the last house to be knocked down will be the same age as Stonehenge is now. We're simply not knocking enough houses down and rebuilding them to actually renew our housing stock. But that gives you an impression, and there's good reasons for that. I live in a Victorian house and like to live in an old house, and that is clearly something which many other people like as well. But it does have an impact, because it means that if we are expecting houses to be around for another 200 years, we have to improve those as well. It's no good just dealing with the new stock. As with the transport solutions, again, we've got benefits not just to the environment but to the social situation. We could cut those terrible excess winter deaths, cut fuel poverty, cut old ladies shivering through winter in their homes. Commercial buildings too, we are miles behind again on the standards of our commercial buildings. The commercial sector is sort of using more and more energy year on year. In fact, it's the fastest growing sector for energy use. There is really good practice to be seen. The Queen's Building, which is a part of De Montfort University, I think it was opened in about 1996. It is a passive cooled and ventilated building, and it uses sort of chimneys to drag the air through, automatic ventilation louvers and so on. It uses almost all natural daylight. It has quite a narrow floor so that no one's too far from a window. They calculated the overhangs and built heavy masonry walls so that not too much solar gain was achieved at the height of the day, and the fairly massive walls inside were able to cut cooling loads. And despite the fact that the equipment in the building is actually generates far more heat than it would do in a sort of average commercial building, actually the cooling is all passive and there is no need for air conditioning. The reduced need for sort of heating pump cut the capital costs at the time by somewhere between a third and a half to what would be expected in a similar building, and it now uses only between probably 25 and 50% of the energy that would be used in a typical building. Now even that looks a bit old and dinosaur-like when you compare it to some of the best practice abroad. The Ingbank HQ in Holland, Ingbank, if you remember, were the people who took over Bearings, have built a building which houses 2,500 employees. Again, it's narrow, so there's, in fact, no desk is further than 23 foot from a window. So there's an enormous amount of natural light in the building, and very little need for supplementary lighting. There's clever designs like louvers to bounce light up into the window, up into the ceiling, from the top of the window up to the ceiling, again, to help the light penetrate further, and various atriums to get light in. There's a large solar gain, an excellent insulation to the whole of the glazing system, though, again, they're still behind because they're using traditional glazing and not the super windows, which have been developed and used in many buildings in the States. It has a combined heat and power plant, so it's a more efficient way of generating the heat and electricity that it does need. Again, no air conditioning. It recovers heat from the computer rooms, which is then pumped into the rest of the building to warm that up. And they built it on the same site as their earlier headquarters, and this building uses just 8% of its predecessor's energy. Cut its energy use by 92%. At the same time as they were building their new headquarters, just next door they were building another bank, very similar building, very similar costs, didn't put the effort into the proper design work, and that uses 5 times more electricity and energy than the Ing Bank does. It cost around about £700,000 extra capital costs to build in all the extra features and so on that they wanted in order to make it energy efficient. They calculate their annual savings at $2.6 million. So it had a payback period of 3 months. I mean, that's the kind of thing that we can be looking to improve our commercial buildings. On the transport side, we've talked about increasing density. That obviously is a very important first step to sorting out transport problems and trying to persuade people onto public transport and not to use their cars continuously. We need to be clear that what we're trying to generate is not mobility. We don't want everyone to have a car and be able to drive wherever they want to drive whenever. We want them to have access to services. And it's access that's important. Actually, most people don't like driving just for the sake of driving. They like driving because that's the only way they can get to the shop, or that's the only way they can get to whatever it is that they want to get to. Car sharing schemes which run in Europe have dramatically cut car use. They're car cooperatives where you pay a fee each year to have a sort of buy into a whole pool of cars. And you can then effectively rent one at a very low rate because you're a part of the scheme on the odd weekend when you need it, not bother on the other times. If you're popping into town to pick something up, you can take a little small city car. If you are moving house that weekend, you can have a van. It's all straightforward. It's a much better way than having your own car and having to worry about maintaining it and all the rest of it. But it's also found that it does definitely lead to less car use. Cycle provision, I mean, again, looking abroad, Groningen in the Netherlands, 48% of all journeys are made by bike. Only 30% of journeys there are made by car. Did I say 40%? I think I meant to say 48%, so it might even be better than I said. It takes building in of the infrastructure. Holland has incredible infrastructure for cyclists. They've actually just built, I can't remember which city it is, but they've built 2 new cycle paths for commuters to get into one of the big Dutch cities. And they've built them covered so that you don't get wet when you're cycling in along them. And then to further add to it, they're actually sort of effectively a huge big tube which you cycle down, running along the side of the road, elevated. And then to further add to it, they've stuck a big fan at each end, so that when you're riding into work, you go on the into work one with the fan behind you, and you're wind assisted all the way. And when you come back from work, you have to go in the other one and get blown back the other way. So it sounds fantastic. Downhill cycling. But actually, it goes further than that, because you think how many houses, particularly in cities and so on, the owners have a bike, and I have a bike and cycle everywhere, and I have to keep it in my hallway and trip over it every time I go in and out of the house. There's nowhere outside my house to keep a bike. That's understandable. My house was built 130 years ago, but it's not. I think it's inexcusable that houses are being built today without the facility to put bikes somewhere, some sort of space to park the bike. So if I make one personal plea to a room full of architects, it's please design in places to park your bike. There's been other developments, things like city logistics, cutting lorry journeys in towns in Germany. It's basically just a cooperative arrangement between the various haulage companies who work in certain cities, where people drop the goods off on the outsides of town. All lorries converge to depots on the outsides of towns, and then those are delivered into the town centre by just a handful of delivery companies. It's cut lorry journeys by over a half in many towns in Germany. Again, there's all sorts of road safety implications. Again, as a cyclist, I know how dangerous HGVs are when they're rumbling through towns and you're trying to cycle past them and they can't see you. So those things are very important as well. And then finally, there's all the little things we can do, the delivery schemes, to make sure that we get our fruit and veg brought to us instead of having to take the car to the supermarket to do it. I mean, if one van could drive down your street and drop fruit and veg off at everybody's house, rather than every person in your street jump in their car and drive to the local supermarket, you would reduce an enormous amount of traffic. And I would guess that most of the people on the street wouldn't mind too much not having to go to Tesco's once a week. Certainly I get as much stuff delivered to my house as possible. I get all sort of organic vegetables delivered, and I just think it's an absolute dream. And to bring GM into it again, if they said there was only a genetically modified box scheme and not a sort of proper food box scheme, I think I'd actually be tempted, because it's the loss of shopping rather than the taste of the organic food that really does it for me. In the wider environment, we need to be thinking about energy generation and places to generate renewable energy from wind and from solar and even from sort of wave and estuary tidal power. We need to be looking for those places. We need to be sensitive. We can't have wind power generated all over some of our most beautiful and remote areas. But there are options. There's plenty of places where we currently put up with an enormous pile of pylons up there, and then we're not allowed to have windmills, which I always think is slightly strange. But there's also the offshore options and so on. And within buildings as well, there is scope for cogeneration to be built into homes, just small-scale solar, possibly small-scale wind, built into buildings, and both supplying that house, but also exporting any excess electricity back into the grid for other people to use. Now, that partly takes imaginative design and ways to fit it in. It also takes changes from the government, who need to make sure that we get a fair price when we sell our electricity back to electricity companies and so on. That would encourage more people to do it. And it does take some technological advance, although photovoltaics are getting cheaper. They are still expensive, I recognise that, but I think we need to be having an eye to the future and make sure that we are building houses which are facing the right way and have roofs facing the right way to make the most of these technologies. In rural areas, we need to shift to sustainable farming. We need to be promoting organics and making sure a larger and larger area of our countryside is farmed organically. We can make it easier for farmers to sell their food at farmers' markets and so on. You know how popular they are in France, where the sort of French are extremely fussy about their food and believe they get far better food through that sort of thing. Again, pressure on the countryside would be eased if we were sorting our towns out and people were happier to move into town and didn't constantly feel the need to move out of town to some sort of rural idyll in the countryside, which very rarely is a rural idyll, as we know. We need to have tougher controls in the countryside on the traffic-generating developments that we see, both the out-of-town supermarkets and out-of-town industrial estates and so on, but also some of the new developments, the new towns and so on, which will be developed. They will be traffic-generating if they're designed in such a way as you have to have a car in order to get around them and get to the nearest shops. If they're designed so that you can move around them and they are on a train line and all the rest of it, then it will be a far lower need to generate traffic from those. And we need all the same rules in the countryside for improving housing standards and energy efficiency and so on as we have in the city. Now, it is a massive challenge. There is no doubt about that. It's probably a challenge of a greater scale than anything we've ever managed before, I think. We've done all sorts of things through science of tackling disease and tackling illness and so on, but I think this one probably goes wider than any of those. It is going to be incredibly difficult. I believe it is doable. I believe that all the best examples in the world show that these problems can be solved. I actually don't think we need environmental solutions to these problems. What we need is political and social solutions to these problems, because it isn't actually a lack of environmental knowledge or anything else which is stopping us achieving this. It's a lack of both the political will to do it, and still we haven't won the argument that this is good for people. We're still seen as people who are sticking up for the planet instead of looking after people. I simply don't believe that's the case. I think there's three things which possibly some of you could do as you leave to help us make this step. Actually, there's 4. One's building those cycling places in your future houses, as I said. For anybody who lives in the southeast, there are 2 weeks left, or even doesn't live in the southeast, there's 2 weeks left to comment on John Prescott's proposals for the housing in the southeast. As many comments being put in as possible to say that the ideas as they stand are not viable, they are going to do enormous damage, would of course help. Now, I have details of the Friends of the Earth person who's coordinating that, and if anybody does want to put in just a short comment, and it needs to be a letter, please see me afterwards and I'll give you a contact so that you can get the details. I think that in future design, energy efficiency should be given a far higher priority. I very naughtily, before I came in, sat outside and read some of the sort of publication lists, and I have to say, sort of environmental sustainability doesn't feature high in those in the publications which are there. It's far more about aesthetics and the appeal of the building and structure and space and so on than it is actually about how much energy those buildings use. I know it's a bit boring, but it is important, and I think that it is something that we do need to focus on. And actually, all the evidence shows that if you have a well-ventilated, well-insulated, well-lit through natural light rather than through electric light building, then they are far more pleasant places to work. They're far more enjoyable for the people who actually have to live in them or work in them or whatever, than badly designed, stuffy, poorly ventilated, overheated buildings. I think finally, I have to say this, of course, I think you should all join Friends of the Earth. So I think that's the final plug.
Anyone else with comments?
Yeah, I just think that combination between environmental concerns, especially with energy saving and conservation, is really going hand in hand. And I personally wish that we have much more connection with that issue, because it really takes a lot of pressure. I mean, he gave us a whole, list of examples what to do, because I also think that it's beyond 12 o'clock. It's 5 past 12, not 5 to 12. And I think we can't choose any longer. We are driven, and hopefully we get the drive to take on what is ahead of us, the landscape and the sort of environmental problems we have. Because if we don't observe how pollution can be reduced and the whole environment can be sorted out, there is no such thing like conservation in the future, because it wouldn't make sense, because it will be blown away by more hurricanes, by rising water levels and so on. So I think one really must take it extremely serious, and it's not a question of style or aesthetics. It really is a conceptual approach which we have to adopt, and of course, hopefully, with some people with an artist's eye, because they are the dreamers. They are the people who dream their utopian ideas. But funny enough, very often, when you have an utopian idea, this reflects much more what is necessary than too much realism and mind searching the past.
Or others have a shot. Art collection. Yes.
With your parliamentary connections, do you have any sense of even a groundswell or mini groundswell of interest from parliamentarians in the objectives of Friends of the Earth?
It seems to be 3 steps forward, 2 steps back, I think, which I think is probably usual for groups in our position. I mean, as an example, there was a huge step change or gear change or whatever you want to call it in the right direction, I think, with the election of the new government. I mean, there were things which perhaps do cross over between the work that I'm involved in and the work that you would be more involved in. Richard Rogers' report on the urban renaissance was an excellent report. It contained all sorts of consideration of the need for to be sustainable, and contained all sorts of targets to try and make them more sustainable. Now, give the government some credit. It commissioned that report, and it came out with a very good one. The problem is it's now, if you like, backpedaling away from it really quite rapidly, because some of the implications are very major, and there is a great deal of timidity within the government about taking on things like transport. I mean, just one issue, Richard Rogers proposed that there should be targets for reducing the amount of traffic. And if you didn't set a target for it and set your policies aimed to meet that target, then you wouldn't actually achieve less traffic. And that was clearly an important thing to do to make our cities more pleasant places to be. I mean, the government has rejected that and backed away from it. And it's backed down really on the, I think really Richard Rogers was nobbled on the target as to whether between Greenfield and Brownfield sites. I think he came up with the government target, which I think is more than just a coincidence. I suspect it was, a target of any more than this won't be considered doable, so it would be ignored. So, but I think, no, I do get very depressed really at how far back they've gone since they first came into power. Having said that, I think among parliamentarians more generally, I think there is more and more interest, and I just think there is unfortunate timidity from the top. And I think it is the top. I actually think it's far more the number 10 part of the government than it is actually the Department of the Environment part of the government. So it's a mixed message.
I want to ask,
Yes, well, I can hear.
whether perhaps Friends of Earth regards excess of wealth as being part of the problem. I mean, we've heard a lot about the need for economic regeneration. I live in Nottingham Gate, which is the area that I grew up in, which arguably, until fairly recently, one could say is as good as it gets in urban setting. But it's just through excess of wealth tipping over into destruction of its own success. Since the Notting Hill film, we've lost our local bookshop. The rent went up from 10,000 a year to 50,000 a year. The people who moved in don't shop locally, don't send their children to school locally, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly think that we would certainly argue that distribution of wealth is a very, very serious problem. That does cause all sorts of difficulties through, as you say, through the forcing of certain people or certain businesses out of certain areas, also through the ability for the better off to buy out of the problems which the poor people are suffering. I mean, that happens with, if you like, everything from, I mean, it's not even just private education, it's private education that gets it in the neck, but how many people actually move house because they know that they don't want to send their kids to that school, and then they send their kids to a state school somewhere else, which is supposed to be a very right-on thing to do. But I mean, it's buying out in exactly the same way, just spending your money on something slightly different. And certainly that does cause enormous problems, the growing inequality. And it causes problems both in this country and in other countries overseas as well. What we've tried to do is to get away from, or to find ways of measuring quality of life which don't just rely on GDP at a national level or personal wealth at an individual level. And we have drawn up something called the Indicator of Sustainable Economic Welfare, ISEW, which tries to take account of all of the other things as well, the amount of leisure time you have, the number of years, not just of life that you have, but the number of years of healthy life and healthy, enjoyable life that you have, and tries to put a value on some of those things to try and give some impression that it isn't actually all just about having loads and loads of money. I mean, even issues like education and access to shops and access to local friends and so on are very important. And we've tried to address it in that way by trying to show the broader picture. And we actually have, the difficulty with an indicator for sustainable economic welfare is that while I might put a very high value on only working 30 hours a week rather than 45 or whatever, there might be somebody else in the room who actually quite likes working 45 hours a week, but would put a higher value on having a park just opposite their house. They are fairly sort of personal, and we actually have on the Friends of the Earth website, it's quite well worth looking at. You get to choose which bits of your life you value the highest. You plug them all in, the computer works it out, and it plots a graph of how your indicator of sustainable economic welfare has changed over the last few years. And the shocking thing is that I've tried all sorts of different combinations and I've never managed to make mine go up. It has always gone down. Now, that's not a personal thing. It's not me having lost my job or anything like that. But it's done on a national basis. But I think that is quite indicative of, yes, sure, I'm richer and our GDP has gone up, but these indicators quite often point the other way.
I don't believe that many of our conservation societies have got the opposite number to you. We don't have parliamentary lobbyists, as far as I know. Ought we to have? Does it work?
No, because I'm not a parliamentary lobbyist.
Well,
It's an interesting point. What I believe, and what Friends of the Earth very much believes, and I haven't really touched on it at all today, is that actually if we're going to make these fundamental changes, it's not about having a friendly dictator who turns up in Downing Street and tells us all exactly what to do, because people won't do it. We actually need to have the active, if not the active participation of everybody, at least their sort of passive consent to make the changes that we want to change. So actually my job is far less about going down there and having words in the ears of ministers, partly because they never agreed to meet me anyway, so I couldn't do it if I wanted to. It's much more about supporting local communities, and using that supporting local communities to put pressure on local members of parliament, and then that groundswell where it comes up through the members of the parliament then starts to have an impact on the government and actually starts to deliver some change. So I think that is how I would recommend doing it. It's not about having someone who can turn up at Westminster and hobnob with a couple of ministers over lunch. It's far more about making sure that locally conservation groups, architectural groups around the country are actually involved in protecting their areas and making their views known. What you possibly could do with is someone at the top coordinating it to make sure that it all happens, but I don't think you need someone in the corridors of power.
do you issue any information to MPs?
Yes, but if you like, my ideal situation is when I have a meeting with either a minister or a member of parliament, because they phone up and ask me for it rather than me having to phone up and ask them for it. And they do that when they've had enough pressure from other people. And of course it's not all black and white. It's not merely, it's not that I never go to parliament or never speak to ministers, but far more the focus of my work is on the local level. And I do believe I actually believe that's the reason Friends of the Earth has had so much more success than many other environmental groups over the last few years.
Because of the amount you do at local level.
Yeah. And for example, this fuel poverty which I've been talking about affects, the number keeps changing depending on which survey you look at, but it is certainly, across the UK, you're talking between 5.5 and 8 million homes suffering from fuel poverty, and the definition is having to spend more than 10% of your income, or your disposable income, heating your house. That is going to require a massive programme, probably costing up to £18.75 billion of work on houses, of retrospective insulation and so on, to try and bring those houses up to a standard. Probably a programme that you're talking about taking 15 years. Now, 3 years ago, we decided we'd try and get such a programme, and we are absolutely on the cusp of getting it. The piece of legislation that we're backing to get it through goes before Parliament next Friday, and it has the full support of all parties in Parliament. So I think to achieve a spending commitment to nearly £20 billion in just 3 years could not have been done by anybody just having a word with the Minister.
Well, this foreign Basel here, there he is. How do your houses down on the perishing lake south of Ireland face up for fuel efficiency? You'll be thinking about it. Yeah. Now, what I propose that we should do, those of you who would like to stay on, we will go through some of the topics, and almost just by nominating a number of the topics that we have been discussing, because there have been so many. And any of the speakers, experts who have talked to us, if they can stay on, they can then answer questions as they come up by topic. And so we will have a further prolonged discussion for as long as you wish or it can be sustained. Because it's quite a good idea to attempt to review what we have heard and learned. And then I think it is too much to try and draw a vision from what we have heard. The vision is too complex, but at any rate, we may draw certain conclusions as to things we ought to be doing or ought not.
And impressions, I think. And that's
well, impressions will come in together.
But I think we should
conservation of energy.
Yeah, no problem. It is, person to contact is Tony Boswell. Oh, shouting it into the microphone.
Can we raise this screen, I wonder? We can. Press the right thing. Don't usually.
So just something to the conversation.
Do you think it's better? I mean, what to do if I live tonight? So I wrote 9 ministers. Not one to live tonight. That's the end. But I mean, something like that is relevant to all these people. So I said all this. I mean, is it was a waste of time? Had some answer back to say, well, that's all. Give me a small pass.
Showing any stuff?
Am I waiting?
Are you showing any slides?
No, I don't think I do. No, I was just getting air and light in.
I felt he would come in. Just come back.